In January 1475, the Ottoman Empire sent 80,000 soldiers into a frozen valley, certain they would crush a shepherd nation and march unopposed into the heart of Europe. But what waited for them in that valley was not a retreating army, not surrender, not fear. It was 20,000 men who had turned the land itself into a weapon, patient, invisible, and ready to kill. High on the frozen ridges, Stephen the Great watched the Ottoman columns snake into the valley below. He had chosen this place. He had shaped it, every tree line, every slope, every patch of thin ice on the frozen river. For weeks, he had burned his own villages, poisoned his own wells, and pulled his people back into the wilderness, all so this moment would come. And when the last Ottoman soldier stepped into the heart of the valley, Stephen gave the signal. War horns shattered the silence. Arrows fell from the fog like rain. Cannons roared from positions no one could see. Cavalry burst from the mist, struck and vanished. And when the Ottomans ran for the frozen river, the ice cracked beneath them. By noon, the most feared army on earth had been torn apart. 80,000 soldiers walked into that valley. Most of them never walked out. A small nation had done the impossible, and the echo of that morning would haunt the Ottoman Empire for generations. In the 1400s, Europe lived in the shadow of conquest. Borders shifted with every war. Kingdoms that existed for centuries vanished in a single campaign, and at the center of this chaos, one empire was swallowing everything in its path. The Ottoman Empire had just taken Constantinople, the greatest city in the Christian world. Their armies moved with terrifying speed. Their reputation was simple. They didn't lose. To the nations of Europe, the Ottomans weren't just an enemy. They were an extinction event, and standing directly in their path was Moldavia, a small principality of forests, rivers, and frozen hills. No powerful allies, no great treasury, no massive fortresses, just stubborn peasants, a patchwork army, and a ruler no one outside Eastern Europe had ever heard of. But Moldavia's geography made it the most dangerous place on the map. It was the gateway. Any empire that wanted to push into Hungary, Poland, or the heart of Europe had to go through Moldavia first. And in the winter of 1475, the Ottomans decided it was time to remove that obstacle forever. They sent 80,000 men to do it. What they didn't know was that Moldavia's ruler had been preparing for this moment his entire life. His name was Stephen, and he had a plan so brutal, so perfectly designed, that it would turn a frozen valley into a graveyard for an empire. Before diving into this forgotten tale of vengeance and survival, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths behind history's most brutal moments, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories of violence and redemption together from different corners of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. To understand what happened at Vaslui, you first have to understand what Stephen was facing, because the Ottoman Empire in 1475 wasn't just powerful. It was the closest thing the medieval world had ever seen to an unstoppable force. 22 years earlier, they had done the unthinkable. Constantinople, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the greatest Christian city on earth, fell in a single siege. The walls that had held back invaders for centuries crumbled under Ottoman cannons, and when Sultan Mehmed II rode through the shattered gates, the message to Europe was clear: nothing is safe anymore. After Constantinople, the conquests didn't slow down. They accelerated. Serbia fell, Bosnia fell. Albania resisted for a while under Skanderbeg, but when he died, that resistance collapsed too. Greece, already fractured, was absorbed piece by piece. The Ottomans pushed into the Aegean, seized islands, raided coastlines. They didn't just win wars, they erased nations. Entire kingdoms that had existed for generations simply stopped existing. Their names became footnotes. Their people became subjects of the Sultan, and the Ottoman war machine kept growing. Their army was unlike anything Europe could match. The Janissaries, elite infantry, trained from childhood, fanatically loyal, formed the core. Around them, waves of cavalry, siege engineers, and provincial soldiers created a force that could overwhelm almost any defense. Their logistics were terrifyingly efficient, their discipline was legendary, and their sultan had one driving ambition: expansion, always expansion. By 1474, the map of Eastern Europe looked like a tide chart, and the tide was Ottoman red, rising every year. Hungary watched nervously from the north, strengthening its border fortresses, but knowing it couldn't hold forever. Poland kept its distance, hoping the storm would pass. Venice, the great maritime power, had already lost too many battles and signed humiliating treaties just to keep trading. The Pope called for crusades, but the knights never came. Europe was paralyzed, too divided, too afraid, too slow, and the Ottomans knew it. They could smell the weakness. Every treaty signed was a confession of fear. Every unanswered raid was an invitation to push further. The empire didn't negotiate because it wanted peace. It negotiated to buy time before the next conquest. By 1474, half of Europe was wondering the same thing. Who's next? The smart money was on Hungary, maybe Poland, perhaps a final push into the Adriatic, but the Ottomans had a different target in mind, a smaller one, a nation so insignificant that most Europeans couldn't even find it on a map. It sat between the great powers like a speed bump on the road to empire, forests, rivers, hills, no famous cities, no legendary armies, just a stubborn population and a young ruler who had spent his entire reign trying not to provoke the beast to his south. His name was Stephen, and in 1474 the beast turned its eyes directly toward him. Moldavia was not the kind of country that appeared in epic poems or grand histories. It had no ancient cities gleaming with marble, no legendary generals whose names echoed across Europe, no treasury overflowing with gold. It was by almost every measure that mattered to the great powers, insignificant. A rural principality tucked into the northeastern corner of the Balkans, Moldavia was a land of deep forests, winding rivers, and frozen hills that turned brutal in winter. Its people were mostly farmers, shepherds, and woodsmen, hardy, practical, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. They had no illusions about their place in the world. They knew they were small, they knew they were poor, and they knew that every century or so, some empire would remember they existed and try to swallow them whole. Moldavia had three things: forests, rivers, and a stubborn population. That was it. No secret weapon, no divine protection, just terrain that was miserable to march through, and people too stubborn to stay conquered. But geography had cursed Moldavia with something it never asked for: importance. Look at a map of Eastern Europe in the 1400s and you'll see the problem immediately. Moldavia sat at a crossroads. To the south, the Ottoman Empire. To the west, the Kingdom of Hungary. To the north, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Three great powers, all pressing against Moldavia's borders, all wanting control of the same thing: the routes that pass through Moldavian territory, the river crossings, the mountain passes, the roads that connected the Black Sea to Central Europe. Every empire that wanted to invade Europe had to go through Moldavia first. That made it valuable. That also made it a target. For decades, Moldavia had survived by playing the giants against each other. Pay tribute to the Ottomans when they demanded it, swear loyalty to Hungary when it was convenient, make promises to Poland when necessary. It was exhausting, humiliating diplomacy, but it worked, barely. The problem was that survival through diplomacy only lasts as long as the giants are distracted. And by 1474, the Ottomans were no longer distracted. They had consolidated their conquests. They had crushed their rivals. And now they were looking north, toward the small principality that sat between them and the heart of Europe. Moldavia had no powerful friends coming to save it. Hungary sent letters of support, but no soldiers. Poland offered sympathy, but no armies. The Pope called for unity, but unity never arrived. When the moment of crisis came, Moldavia would stand alone, against 80,000 Ottoman soldiers, with no allies, no great fortresses, no legendary army, just forests, rivers, and stubborn people. By any reasonable calculation, Moldavia was already dead. The Ottomans just hadn't delivered the killing blow yet, but Moldavia had one thing the Ottomans didn't count on: a ruler who refused to play by their rules. His name was Stephen, and he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Stephen had been ruling Moldavia since 1457, almost 2 decades on a throne that most men wouldn't survive 2 years, and he had done it not through grand victories or legendary battles, but through something far less glamorous: patience. He understood power in a way that most rulers didn't. He knew that Moldavia could never match the Ottomans in open war. Not in soldiers, not in gold, not in cannons. If he tried to fight them the way Hungary or Serbia had fought them, Moldavia would be crushed in a single campaign. So he didn't fight. Not yet. Instead, Stephen watched, and he learned. He watched Serbia resist the Ottomans with pride and defiance. He watched them lose battle after battle until there was nothing left to lose. He watched Bosnia try to negotiate to find some middle ground, some compromise that would let them keep their identity. The Ottomans took everything anyway. He watched Albania hold out under Skanderbeg, brave, brilliant Skanderbeg, and then collapse the moment their hero died. Stephen watched 3 neighbouring kingdoms get absorbed by the Ottomans. Each one thought they could negotiate. Each one thought they were different. Each one was wrong. So Stephen did something that looked, to the outside world, like cowardice. He paid the tribute. When Ottoman ambassadors arrived demanding money, he smiled and handed it over. When they demanded political concessions, he nodded and agreed. When they treated Moldavia like a vassal state, he bowed his head and said nothing. His own nobles whispered that he was weak. Foreign courts assumed Moldavia had already surrendered in everything but name. The Ottomans themselves grew comfortable, confident that this small principality knew its place. That was exactly what Stephen wanted them to think, because behind the submissive facade, Stephen was preparing. He studied Ottoman tactics obsessively, how they moved, how they supplied their armies, how they exploited terrain. He quietly strengthened his military, training light cavalry that could strike fast and disappear faster. He mapped every river crossing, every forest path, every valley in Moldavia where an invading army might be vulnerable. He paid the tribute, he smiled at the ambassadors, and he waited. For 17 years, Stephen played dead. He let the Ottomans believe he was tame, broken, irrelevant. He swallowed every insult, absorbed every humiliation, and never once gave them a reason to see him as a threat. But Stephen was never tame. He was coiled, waiting for the moment when the Ottomans would finally push too far and give him the war he had been preparing for his entire reign. That moment came in late 1474. The Ottomans made a demand that Stephen couldn't accept. The details vary depending on who tells the story. Some say it was control of key fortresses. Others say it was a level of submission that would have ended Moldavian independence entirely. But the result was the same. Stephen said no, and then he made a decision that would terrify his own people. For years, the Ottoman demands had followed a predictable pattern: tribute, loyalty oaths, minor concessions that chipped away at Moldavian pride but left its independence technically intact. Stephen paid, he complied, he survived. But in late 1474, the tone changed. The new demands weren't requests, they were ultimatums. The Ottomans wanted direct control of key Moldavian fortresses, the ones that guarded the critical river crossings and mountain passes. They wanted Stephen to supply soldiers for Ottoman campaigns, turning Moldavian men into tools of the empire. They wanted a level of submission that would make Moldavia a province in everything but name. The Ottomans weren't asking for tribute anymore. They were asking for Moldavia's soul. Stephen had spent 17 years bending so he wouldn't break. But this was different. If he agreed to these terms, there would be no Moldavia left to protect. The country would become a puppet, hollowed out from the inside, waiting for the day the Ottomans decided to finish the absorption. He had watched it happen to Serbia, to Bosnia, to every nation that thought compliance would save them. Compliance didn't save anyone. It just delayed the execution. The message from Istanbul sat on Stephen's table for 3 days. His advisors argued. Some urged him to negotiate, to buy more time, to find some compromise that would keep the Ottomans satisfied for another year. Others whispered that resistance was suicide, that 80,000 soldiers would descend on Moldavia and leave nothing but ashes. Stephen listened to all of it. Then he made his decision. He looked at the message from Istanbul. Then he looked at his generals, and he said 2 words: "Prepare everything." The room went silent. Every man there understood what those words meant. War with the Ottoman Empire, war against an army 4 times the size of anything Moldavia could field, war that, by every conventional calculation, they could not win. But Stephen wasn't thinking about conventional calculations. He had spent 17 years studying the Ottomans. He knew their strengths: overwhelming numbers, superior logistics, disciplined infantry, but he also knew their weaknesses. They relied on speed and open terrain. They struggled in harsh winters. They expected enemies to meet them in the field, where Ottoman numbers could crush any opposition. Stephen had no intention of meeting them in the field. His generals expected him to start fortifying cities, stockpiling weapons, drilling soldiers for the battles to come. Standard preparations for standard war, but prepare everything didn't mean what his generals thought. Stephen wasn't preparing for battle. He was preparing for something much darker. He was going to turn Moldavia itself into a weapon, and that meant doing things that would make his own people question his sanity. The orders he gave over the following weeks would horrify his soldiers, devastate his villages, and leave his country looking like it had already been destroyed. That was exactly the point. The first order came in December 1474. Stephen gathered his commanders and told them something that made seasoned warriors stare at him in disbelief. Burn the villages. All of them. Not the enemy's villages. Their own. Every settlement along the routes the Ottomans would use to march north. Every barn, every storehouse, every grain reserve that could feed an invading army. Burn it all. His generals thought he had lost his mind, but Stephen hadn't lost anything. He had simply accepted a truth that most leaders couldn't face. Moldavia could not win a conventional war. The Ottomans had 80,000 soldiers. Stephen had 20,000. If the Ottomans marched into Moldavia and found food to eat, shelter to use, and roads to travel, they would crush his army in weeks. The math was simple and brutal. So Stephen changed the math. He ordered the evacuation of every village in the Ottomans' path. Families packed what they could carry and fled north into the forests and mountains. Livestock was driven away or slaughtered. Wells were poisoned. Food stores that couldn't be moved were set on fire. The roads themselves were sabotaged. Trees felled across paths. Bridges weakened. River crossings disguised to look safe when they weren't. Moldavian soldiers carried out the orders with tears in their eyes. They burned the homes of their own neighbours. They destroyed crops their own families had planted. They turned the land they were supposed to protect into a frozen wasteland. If the Ottomans wanted Moldavia, they'd find nothing but ash, ice, and silence. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of civilians fled into the winter cold with almost nothing. Villages that had stood for generations disappeared in a single night. The countryside that had been Moldavia's heart became a graveyard of blackened timber and empty fields. Stephen watched it happen and gave no sign of hesitation. He couldn't afford hesitation. Every barn left standing was food for Ottoman soldiers. Every intact road was a faster march to Moldavian defeat. Sentiment was a luxury for nations that had allies and options. Moldavia had neither. This wasn't heroic. There were no songs written about burning your own country. No glory in poisoning wells that your own people had drunk from for centuries. This was survival at its most brutal, the cold calculation that losing everything was better than losing everything and your freedom too. By January 1475, the southern reaches of Moldavia looked like they had already been conquered. Smoke hung over empty villages, snow-covered fields where nothing grew. The land itself seemed dead, and that was exactly what Stephen wanted the Ottomans to see. But burning his country was only phase one. The scorched earth would slow the Ottomans down, starve them, freeze them. It would make them miserable, but it wouldn't make them turn back. An army of 80,000 doesn't retreat because of discomfort. Phase two was even more calculated. Stephen needed the Ottomans to feel invincible. He needed them blind with confidence. He needed them to walk straight into his trap. Burning Moldavia was only half the plan. The other half was even more devious. Stephen needed the Ottomans to feel like they had already won. An army marching through hostile territory stays alert. They watch for ambushes. They move cautiously. They keep their formations tight. But an army marching through a country that's already collapsing, that army gets comfortable. That army gets careless. So Stephen gave them exactly what they expected to see, a nation falling apart. As the Ottoman force crossed into Moldavia in late December, they encountered Moldavian cavalry almost immediately. Small units, fast riders. The Moldavians would appear on a ridge, watch the Ottoman columns for a few minutes, and then flee before anyone could engage them. Every time Ottoman scouts spotted Moldavian cavalry, they ran. Every supply convoy that strayed too far from the main force got hit, arrows from the trees, a few wagons burned, and then the attackers vanished before Ottoman reinforcements could arrive. It looked like harassment. desperate, disorganized harassment from an army too weak to stand and fight. The Ottoman commanders took note. The Moldavians weren't forming battle lines. They weren't defending their burned-out villages. They weren't even trying to slow the advance in any meaningful way. They were just running, hitting and running like bandits, not soldiers. To the Ottomans, it looked like chaos, like a country falling apart, like Stephen's army was already broken and scattering into the wilderness. Exactly what Stephen wanted them to think. Every retreat was calculated. Every skirmish was designed to reinforce the same message. Moldavia is finished. Their army is shattered. Their leader has no plan. All that remains is to march north and collect the victory. The Ottoman commander, Hadim Suleiman Pasha, was an experienced general. He had conquered territories before. He knew what a dying resistance looked like, and everything he saw in Moldavia confirmed his assessment. The scorched villages, the fleeing cavalry, the lack of any organized defense. This wasn't going to be a war. It was going to be an execution. He sent reports back to Istanbul. Moldavia was collapsing. Stephen had no answer for Ottoman power. The campaign would be over within weeks, perhaps days. There was no need to slow down, no need for excessive caution. The road to victory was open. By early January, Suleiman Pasha was convinced Moldavia was finished. He ordered the army to march north and deliver the killing blow, to find Stephen, destroy whatever ragged force he had left, and end this campaign before winter made travel impossible. He had no idea he was walking into the most carefully designed ambush in history. Ahead of him, hidden in a fog-covered valley near a town called Vaslui, Stephen waited. 20,000 men, silent, invisible, positioned on every ridge, behind every tree line, beside every frozen river crossing. The trap was set. All that remained was for the Ottomans to walk into it. Stephen's army was not built for glory. It was built for survival. 20,000 men. That was all Moldavia could muster against the Ottoman tide. No massive infantry formations, no siege engines, no heavy cavalry in gleaming armor. What Stephen had was something different. An army designed not to win battles, but to make sure the enemy never got the chance to fight one. Stephen didn't build an army to fight the Ottomans. He built an army to haunt them. At the core were his light cavalry. Fast, mobile, lethal. These weren't knights charging in formation. They were raiders, men who could cover miles of frozen terrain in hours, strike a target, and disappear into the forest before the enemy knew what had hit them. They carried bows, not lances. They wore leather and fur, not plate armor. They were ghosts on horseback. Behind them came the archers, thousands of bowmen recruited from villages across Moldavia, peasants, most of them, men who had hunted deer in these forests their entire lives. They knew how to move silently through the trees. They knew how to find cover where none seemed to exist, and they knew how to put an arrow through a gap in armor at 50 paces. Then there were the infantry, not professional soldiers. Moldavia couldn't afford those. These were farmers, woodsmen, shepherds, men who had left their burned villages and frozen fields to fight for the only home they had ever known. They weren't trained for open battle, but they knew the land. They knew every stream, every ridge, every patch of ice that looked solid but wasn't. Every man knew the terrain. Every archer knew where to hide. Every cavalry unit knew exactly when to strike and when to vanish. Stephen had spent years preparing them for this moment, not drilling them in parade formations or siege tactics, but teaching them how to use Moldavia itself as a weapon, how to lure an enemy into unfavorable ground, how to attack from angles that shouldn't exist, how to melt into the wilderness and reappear where no one expected. They trained in the forests they would fight in. They memorized the valleys where the killing would happen. They learned the rhythm of ambush warfare, patience, then violence, then silence again. By January 1475, they were ready, not confident. Nobody facing 80,000 Ottomans felt confident, but ready to do what Stephen had asked of them, ready to fight not as a conventional army, but as something the Ottomans had never faced before, an army of ghosts. On January 9th, 1475, Stephen positioned his entire force in a valley near a small town called Vaslui. The terrain was perfect. Narrow passages, forested ridges, frozen marshes, and a river whose ice had been carefully mapped for every weak point. And then Stephen did something strange. He prayed for fog. Stephen got his fog. On the morning of January 10th, 1475, a thick white mist rolled through the valley near Vaslui. It clung to the frozen ground, swallowed the ridgelines, and turned the world into a pale, silent void. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. A man couldn't see 20 feet in front of him. For the Ottomans, it was an inconvenience. For Stephen, it was a gift from God. The Ottoman army entered the valley in long, confident columns, 80,000 soldiers marching toward what they believed was a broken enemy. They moved slowly in the fog, officers shouting orders that disappeared into the mist, formations stretching and compressing as men struggled to stay together. The fog was so thick the Ottomans couldn't see their own officers giving orders, and they couldn't see what was waiting for them. High on the ridges, hidden behind trees and snow-covered earthworks, 20,000 Moldavians watched in absolute silence. Archers held their breath, cavalry gripped their reins. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant rumble of Ottoman boots on frozen ground. Stephen waited until the columns were deep in the valley, committed, no easy retreat. Then he gave the signal. War horns shattered the silence. They came from everywhere, left, right, ahead, behind. In the fog, it was impossible to tell where the sound originated. The Ottomans froze. Officers screamed for formation. Soldiers spun in confusion, searching the mist for enemies they couldn't see. Then the arrows came. The arrows didn't fall like rain. They fell like judgment. Thousands of shafts dropped from the fog, finding gaps in armor, punching through shields, cutting down men who never saw what killed them. The Ottomans raised their defenses, but they were shooting blind. They couldn't see the archers. They couldn't see anything. Before they could regroup, the cavalry struck. Moldavian riders exploded from the mist, appearing like ghosts, slashing through Ottoman flanks, then vanishing before anyone could counterattack. They hit from the left, then the right, then both at once. The disciplined Ottoman formations began to crack. Panic spread faster than orders. Men broke ranks. Some charged toward enemies that weren't there. Others retreated into their own allies. The fog twisted everything: sound, direction, command. The Ottoman army was fighting shadows. And then they ran. Thousands of soldiers fled toward the frozen river, desperate to escape the valley of death. When the first men reached the ice, they thought they were saved. Then the ice cracked. Bodies plunged into freezing water. Men scrambled over each other, clawing for solid ground that kept breaking beneath them. The Moldavians had mapped every weak point. They knew exactly where the ice would hold and where it wouldn't. The Ottomans didn't. By noon, it was over. The once mighty army had shattered. Standards lay trampled in the snow. The valley floor was a carpet of bodies, broken weapons, and dying men. But what the fog revealed when it lifted, even Stephen wasn't prepared for. When the fog lifted, the valley looked like the end of the world. Bodies lay scattered across the frozen ground, thousands of them, still and silent where they had fallen. Ottoman standards, once carried with pride at the head of an invincible army, now lay trampled in the snow. Weapons, shields, and armor littered the valley floor. The frozen river was worse. Men who had drowned, clawing at broken ice, floated beneath the surface, their faces locked in final moments of terror. Stephen rode through the carnage slowly. He didn't cheer. He didn't raise his sword in triumph. He simply looked. This was what survival cost. His soldiers moved through the battlefield, finishing the wounded, gathering weapons, taking prisoners where they could. The scale of the destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. The most feared army on earth had walked into this valley, expecting an easy conquest. Most of them would never walk out. Estimates vary, but the Ottoman losses were catastrophic. Tens of thousands dead, countless more wounded, scattered or drowned. The commander, Hardem Suleiman Pasha, barely escaped with his life. The army that was supposed to erase Moldavia from the map had been erased instead. News of the victory spread across Europe like wildfire. Messengers rode through the night carrying letters to Hungary, Poland, Rome. At first, no one believed it. A tiny principality had destroyed an Ottoman army 4 times its size. Impossible. But as the reports were confirmed, disbelief turned to astonishment, then celebration. The Pope called Stephen a champion of Christendom. Bells rang in churches across Europe. Kings and nobles who had ignored Stephen's pleas for help now praised him as a hero. In Rome they spoke of miracles. In Vienna they spoke of hope. For the first time in decades, it seemed like the Ottoman tide could be stopped. But Stephen wasn't celebrating. He rode back to his camp that evening and began giving orders: reinforce the fortresses, repair the roads, resupply the army, prepare for what comes next. Because Stephen understood something the celebrating courts of Europe didn't. This wasn't the end. The Ottoman Empire was vast, wealthy, and relentless. They had lost battles before. They always came back, stronger, angrier, more determined. Vaslui had bought Moldavia time. It had not bought peace. Stephen would spend the rest of his reign fighting against the Ottomans, against Hungary, against Poland, against anyone who threatened his people. He would win more battles and lose some too. He would be remembered as one of the greatest military minds of his era. But on that January evening in 1475, standing in a valley filled with the dead, Stephen allowed himself one quiet truth: Moldavia had survived. And sometimes survival is the only victory that matters. The Ottomans would come back. They always came back. But today, they had lost. And because they lost, Europe got to breathe for one more generation. If you made it this far, you're now one of the few people who know about one of history's greatest ambushes. Most people have never heard of Vaslui. Most people have never heard of Stephen the Great. But in January 1475, a shepherd nation stood against an empire and won. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this, and drop a comment. What would you have done if 80,000 soldiers were marching toward your home?